cetera. But with project analyses, you focus on return on investment, and those are usually for planned unit developments, or a term in Florida they use are called DRIs, developments of regional impact. But I think that's a term that's applicable to every state whenever you get these large mixed-use planned unit development type projects. And then finally, we do a lot, I mean, most of our work isn't on the project analysis. Most of our work is actually as part of planning efforts. And a lot of times we're on teams with a land use planning firm and a transportation firm, and we're just the economic consultant. And part of what we're doing as part of the land use plan is, as the visioning session happens and scenarios are developed, we do the modeling of what does that mean? What happens if we open up this area for growth, and we try to encourage mixed-use nodes in certain areas, but then redevelop the core. So we look at those types of scenarios. We usually do it on a citywide or countywide basis. Sometimes it's related to area plans, sometimes it's annexation studies, etc. So I mentioned this one, so we'll skip this slide. I talked about the fiscal zoning. This is an example of how you define those different land uses. You would do things like the assessed value, which can be very different than the market value, the persons per unit, the lot widths, because lot widths influence how much road mileage is needed in the system, and then you have things like vehicle trip rates, etc. Project analyses, usually you want to do one or multiple, or excuse me, instead of one, you want to do multiple development programs, because typically what happens is the developer walks in the door with a very optimistic scenario, and so you want to do varying scenarios to understand what happens if things don't go to plan. Also analyzes the impacts of the combination of the proposed uses instead of those individual discrete land uses. It's usually prepared in conjunction with the development proposal. Okay, and this is an example in West Windsor, New Jersey. We worked on a TOD project for a developer. And we don't do a lot of private work because we're very cognizant of being accused of talking out of both sides of our mouths. So we tend to take engagements that are typically on the Atlantic seaboard or in very urban areas where it's usually a redevelopment project. It's usually TOD oriented, it's mixed use. Usually there's available infrastructure capacity. It's usually in the best interest all parties to have the deal happen rather than just doing subdivisions over somebody's farm. So this is a redevelopment project with 3 properties. It's going to open up an abandoned train station and make it part of the metro system there. This developer had a $3 million entitlement budget. We were there for a week-long charrette, and he flew a group up from Argentina that does the the 3D flyover kind of things that you see in charrettes. And throughout the week, they actually scanned people in the audience at the charrette. And by the final presentation, when you were doing the flyover, people could see themselves walking through the project. It was really cool. But the big issue in Jersey, students. Okay, everybody's afraid of school children, even though a lot of these places are dying, they're losing population, the school systems have capacity. And even though most TOD projects, and we did an extensive data collection as part of this, most TOD and mixed-use projects generate fewer school children for multifamily units than the average. However, we're advocates of using the average because it's a new trend, and I think what's going to happen, and I've seen happen in a few communities, is you start off young, professional, high income, no kids, but then you get married and you like the community, and in 7 years you do generate some school children. So I'd rather be conservative and overestimate the school costs. But this is what the school children were under the TOD type development. And we see here that from a fiscal perspective, even with tax increment financing, that this was a good deal for the city. But I will tell you this, at that charrette, I've never been threatened and had fingers pointed at me as often as I did there. I joked afterwards with the developer. I said, if Missouri is the show me state, New Jersey is the all F and tell you state. Because that's what they did at every charrette. But even though the township would benefit from $2.8 million in offsite infrastructure provided by the developer, the township and school district could absorb all of these costs without substantial outlays, because sprawl is the only thing worse than density. I seem to run into that quite a bit. The project was denied. And his subsequent development in Princeton was denied as well. And meanwhile, these communities are dying, and it's a great chance to implement some of the New Jersey smart growth planning guidelines. And it's always the silent majority that you never hear from. Did you have a question?
Is it due to the density? Is that what it is?
Oh yeah, density equals
Is
is bad. Density is bad, and it generates school kids, is what the public thinks. So it's denied. Area-wide analyses, as I mentioned, can be applied area-wide or county or city-wide. Usually you're looking out over time, 10 or 20 years, and you're evaluating multiple scenarios that vary things like land use pattern, land use mixes, pace of growth, and other economic activity. And this just shows you an example here of how that would look. You define these different land use types and then say, here's the absorption schedule going forward over time. And so you're looking at the combined impact of all these uses. You don't then separate out from the total, what does it mean for single family versus duplex versus some other use. And this is an example of how you use the geographies I mentioned earlier. As you can imagine, Hillsborough County, Florida, which is where the city of Tampa is located, if you're going to do a fiscal analysis for Hillsborough County, you've got Tampa here, all of this, you would think you're in Tampa, even though you're in the unincorporated county. Then out here, you're very rural. And you can imagine, the densities are different, the assessed values are different, the type of non-residential activity is different. That's why you want to use zones, right? So you can tailor the inputs into the models. It's much more accurate than being sort of homogeneous for a jurisdiction. And this just shows you an example of the kind of outputs you get here. And we looked at not only Hillsborough County government, but the school board. The school board is its own taxing entity, but it is continuous with the county, so it has the exact same boundaries there. As you can see here, this is the impact of the marginal costing. I mentioned earlier that if you're using average cost, because this all generates deficits, the deficits would just sort of go like that, right? But because of the timing and the staging of the development scenario, you get this more detailed information. And every time you see a big spike here, particularly for the schools, it's when you're having to open schools. And you're not only constructing a $60 million school, it now costs how many millions of dollars to operate it. So from planning applications, we're seeing, I mentioned the term sustainability. You always hear about environmental sustainability, transportation sustainability. You never hear about fiscal or economic sustainability, it seems like. Although we're seeing more and more interest in that, we don't see it sort of bandied about in the same way that other types of sustainability are mentioned. So you look at, well, what's the validity of the comprehensive plan? So if you haven't evaluated your land use plan, it begs the question, how can you implement or afford to implement the plan? Answering the question, is growth really pay for itself? Looking at comprehensive rezonings, is annexation fiscally beneficial? I mean, that's huge. I mean, the revenue is the easy part of annexation. Everybody can figure out the revenue. The hard part is, well, what does it cost to maintain or provide the same level of service you're providing in the city to the newly annexed area? And what is it, in a lot of cases, when you're not annexing virgin land, you've got substandard county roads that now have to be brought up to the city's level of service. And so all of that has a cost, and it's very hard to determine. And then did the recession reveal structural revenue issues? I mean, believe it or not, 7 or 8 years removed from the recession, I guess we're 6 years removed from the recession. Communities are still being impacted. And most local governments' revenues haven't gotten back to the pre-recession levels. They're closed. They haven't gotten all the way back. It's also been the longest period post-recession for local government revenue to get close to what those levels were. It usually happened within about 2 years after you left the recession. What types of developments should be incentivized, and if so, what types and how much? and then evaluating development projects and individual rezoning applications. Now, from a budget and finance perspective, the analyses are a little different. So we have a lot of long-term financial planning. In fact, we've actually developed some models that they don't even call them fiscal models, they call them financial models. But it's looking at this question that I mentioned earlier, are you living off of tomorrow's growth? And so they tie the models that we develop into their annual budgeting process. Also, we get involved a lot in the capital improvement programming, particularly with scenarios where once you've shown, for instance, in Howard County, Maryland, we did this recently where we showed that growth paid for itself, which it often does in Maryland because of the revenue structure. But then the question became, well, we have this huge infrastructure replacement backlog. What happens when we overlay that with the results? How does that change our situation? Playing what-if games with revenue trends. For instance, we've got many clients that are very worried about the condition of the retail market. And so a lot of times the models can be used to do sensitivity analysis with retail spending patterns, the amount of retail that you're actually capturing within your community, looking at playing what-if games with declines to see where you're going to be from a fiscal perspective. Also addressing funding responsibilities as the state and local government sources dry up. I remember, I'm just going to date myself a little bit, but I remember in the 90s we were doing a lot of analyses about what happens when the COPS grants expire that the Clinton administration had. Because a lot of jurisdictions had these excess police officers and they were going to then have to pay for them themselves. Levels of service changes. The first thing we get asked when we show that growth pays for itself in a jurisdiction is, well, wow, we can raise the level of service for parks because we just had this survey that said everybody wants 5 acres of parkland per 1,000. We're now at 3. You got to keep in mind that most of the time that we're showing surpluses, when you look at what percentage that is of the overall budget, it's usually less than 1%. So it doesn't leave room for any tax decreases or level of service enhancements. And finally, because of lots of demographic shifts, which also relate to retail and other things we've touched on, we're doing brainstorming about that. And I'm going to show you an example of that here in a few minutes. But this is a great slide from Draper, Utah, a development called Suncrest. And I mentioned that a lot of times the developer comes in with a very optimistic, rosy scenario. And in this case, it is. And to give you perspective, Draper's in Salt Lake. And so at the southern end of the city, there's a mountain, and there's an area called the Bench. Suncrest is going to be elevated, and the rest of the city's down here. Okay? And it was part of an annexation agreement in the 70s, but all of a sudden they thought there was a market for it. And myself and Paul Tischler told them back in the 90s, we said, let them sue you because it's going to cost you less to pay the lawsuit than it will be to service Suncrest. And we turned out we were right. But the developer shows that in year 1, because you have to build a police and a fire substation because it is beyond the built environment of Draper, okay? So you have that deficit, but then everything's rosy. Well, we said, well, what happens after a few winters up there and the wind, you're exposed to the wind? I don't think this is going to be as marketable as you think. So what happens if it's a 20-year absorption? It completely changes. You don't even break even until year 15. And what happened with Suncrest is it went gangbusters for like 2 or 3 years, and then it went belly up, and it's transferred from owner to owner, and it's still not completely built out. And it's been a huge drain on Draper's resource. This shows the impact of demographic shifts in Howard County. We've done work on both of their plans that have won APA awards, and this was in 2000 they were thinking about this, where we looked at the different land use planning scenarios, and then as part of phase 2, we looked at 2 scenarios that assumed different assumptions. One is that the folks that are in Howard County in 2000 age in place, okay, versus a high mobility, meaning that the houses turn over and you still have this constant influx of younger families with school kids and that sort of thing. And so we had to do a lot of brainstorming with department staff on this scenario to sort of envision what happens if all these folks age in place? How does that change the way you provide services, particularly from Parks and Rec and leisure, libraries, community centers, health, that sort of thing? It'd be a very different situation than if things continued as usual. And obviously, because you're going to generate more school kids, the high mobility was the least desirable. And this also had an infrastructure replacement overlay with it as well. There's the enhanced infrastructure replacement. And this is an example of land use planning, a smaller scale than what I showed you in Florida in Hillsborough County. This is Champaign, Illinois, and we basically broke the city into different areas. This was the infill area, and these were the nodes that we were looking at in the sort of undeveloped parts of the city. But we basically looked at two things. What happens if growth stays within the planned urban service area versus growth beyond, or more of a scattershot type of development pattern? You can see here that the results are quite different. Growth within the service area, it has 1 or 2 years where deficits are generated, but it was positive to the city of Champaign, whereas the scattershot development pattern required much more infrastructure, wasn't an efficient use of land, and so the story was very, very different. Okay. So this shows the results differently. Those were the annual results. This shows the results cumulatively. And again, much like the scenario we showed in Kansas, the operating budget's in good shape. There are no fiscal structural deficiencies there. The capital budget was the one we had to worry about. And this just shows the results from a geographic perspective. And this was telling, and we did this about 10 years ago. And now, I was in Champaign recently, downtown has just taken off. They've incentivized things, they've changed their land use policies. As you can see here, if they continue to grow at outward expansion, those areas require a lot of infrastructure investment. So, what do you do with these findings? Well, the results were driven primarily by the higher capital costs, but the results show an inefficient development pattern, and it also supported a tiered impact fee system. The results showed that if you came up with a road impact fee system, it would go a long way to solve the capital deficits, because much of that was transportation related, and you could discount the fees in the urban core and help incentivize development because of the lower transportation costs. This is one of my favorite analyses. This was from Sahuarita, Arizona. It's a little town outside of Tucson. And they had a developer wanted to develop a mixed-use center called Rancho Sahuarita, and he was asking for a tax rebate of 50% of the sales tax to pay for his infrastructure projects that if you were probably in Meridian, he'd be expected to pay for himself. And so the question was being asked, does this incentive make financial sense? And on the surface, it does, okay? If we looked at a 25-year payback versus a 30-year payback, we see that under both scenarios, even giving away 50% of the sales tax, on the surface, it still looks good, okay? But there's a few caveats here. One is, due to, the surpluses were being generated because of the amount of non-residential development served. And 75% of that was retail, so it's generating a large amount of sales tax. And keep in mind, this was before the retail shakeout that we're experiencing now, which still isn't over. We also looked at maintaining current levels of service, and that was a huge assumption because this was a brand new community. It had only been incorporated about 8 years at that point. And so what we have found in these newly developing communities, particularly in Arizona, is that as the communities get larger, the folks are coming in from different parts of the country, and they have expectations for level of service that can be very different than what the folks that were there when they incorporated are used to or expect. And so that has a cost, okay? So that's another reason why you don't give up that 50%, because you're going to have those demands in the future, right? Major retailers will be coming regardless of incentives. They had money for a market analysis, so we did a lot of market work there, and we felt very confident that regardless of the incentives, they were going to come. because there's money to be made. But the big point is that the analysis did not include the fact that 700 housing units from phase one already exist. You're not generating any revenue from because they get no property tax, right? And you're going to have to likely pay for the improved levels of service from these folks, plus the ones that are coming with the new development. It's also important to note that they waived their ability to collect impact fees as part of the development agreement as well. And this is an interesting one because we don't see a lot of analyses that are combining the fiscal and the economic as part of one analysis. And this is from Orangeburg County, South Carolina, a very poor county right on the interstate, but it's an hour from Charleston. And for those of you who may not know what's happening in Charleston, they got a Boeing assembly plant for the Dreamliner years ago, plus they have a major port. They're benefiting from the changes with the Suez Canal. So there's all sorts of economic activity happening in that corridor from a logistics perspective. And so Orangeburg hired us to look at, we have targeted these industries for our county. Does it make sense? And so we looked at the direct and indirect employment. Industries studied were identified as the target industries, as I mentioned. So we're looking at what type of industries pay for themselves, what non-residential land uses are giving you the best economic and fiscal return, and so therefore they should be considered for incentives. What are the direct and indirect economic effects of those industries, and are we losing jobs to neighboring counties, which was key. So you can see here that when you look at the direct employment in blue, some industries generate more direct employment than they generate indirect employment. And so chemical manufacturing wasn't even on their watch list. Okay? As you can see here, for every job gained here, you're probably getting an increase of twofold over that one job. So that was very valuable data. And we also then looked at the revenue and expenditures from a direct perspective. These are the direct jobs, and then these are the spin-off. And so look, the spin-off here was huge for chemical manufacturing. So then the question becomes, there's the combined results here. But then the question becomes, what jobs are we losing to the other counties in the area, Dorchester, Berkeley, and I forget the other one. And that was the real sort of mind-opening part of the analysis is to understand how much revenue is being lost to your neighboring jurisdictions, which gives you an idea of what you have to do to try to win those jobs back. So takeaway from incentive analyses is, one, you need to understand the market conditions and the necessary public sector investments or interventions necessary. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here at the end. You have to put the fiscal results in the context of the economic and other benefits versus the cost of doing nothing, which can also, in a lot of older cities, lead to disinvestment. In my opinion, marginal costing is critical because it's going to define those differences between the staging and the timing of development. It represents the true way that local governments do business. And it also allows you to measure those costs of intervention. Well, again, I'll talk a little bit about intervention here in a second. So let's move on to my new pet peeve, which is this advocacy being passed off as an analysis. And I see this a lot, particularly in the planning industry, as we're trying to sell folks on our ideas. And I think you can't blame planners in general. I think it's our evolution of our society. I mean, we like to think to digest things in small infographics and not spend a lot of time reading and get to the point kind of thing. And so these sort of lend themselves to that. So I just put the Smart Growth America cover on here. They came out with a report, I want to say it was 5 years ago, Building Better Budgets. Some of our work was featured in it, among others. But basically, the three conclusions were that the cost of infrastructure savings was 38%, which I think is high. The cost of service savings is about 10%, higher in rural areas. And tax revenue per acre under smart growth is 10 times that of traditional development. Now, I think there's some good information in this report, but I think it's very misleading because they gleaned results from a lot of different studies, and they didn't really do an apples to apples of each study to contrast what methodology was used. Was it average cost? Was it marginal? And I would bet money that ours was the only study in there that used marginal costing, because most people use average. Some studies were just focused on certain services, like one was from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, that focused just on fire and didn't look at anything else in Mecklenburg County. And we have found that the infrastructure cost is usually about 15% savings for an infrastructure. But there's some good stuff in this report, and I'm not saying that this is an advocacy piece, but what's happened is some of the reports that they used here are now the bane of my existence. These are called revenue per acre studies. Has anybody seen these? Where they basically show a Walmart versus mixed use downtown. Has anybody seen this before?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very simple argument here, where if we put a Walmart on an acre of land in Asheville, North Carolina, in this case, you're only going to generate $50,000 per acre. But if you put stuff downtown, you get $414,000 per acre. Okay? So, several reasons this is dangerous. One is that now people are passing this off as, if you just increase density downtown, you are going to save your community. In fact, I was at the Virginia American Planning Association conference a few years ago. There's a guy named Edward Bacon. He's got a blog called Bacon's Rebellion that focuses on land use issues. And he was the keynote speaker. And the title of his presentation, which was all about this stuff, was How Virginia Planners Can Save Virginia Municipalities from the Fiscal Abyss. That's hyperbole at its finest. So the idea here is if we just take smart growth principles or increase density downtown, it's going to be a boon to us fiscally. Well, there's several problems with this. Let me move through my animation here. One, it's a simplistic analysis. In fact, in the beginning, they weren't even fiscal analyses because they didn't have a cost associated with them at all. They just focused on revenue. Okay? Ignores the market realities. Okay? There is a reason certain things haven't happened in Dubuque, Iowa, or certain things haven't happened in Asheville, North Carolina, for that matter, because there is not a market for that density yet. Okay? And in order to force that market, it's going to require intervention. And that intervention has a cost. And that intervention could be infrastructure investment, provision of mass transit, provision of parking. It could be any number of things that need to happen to force that, which now has a cost. Okay? No, as I mentioned, no real credible analysis of cost. Initially, they ignored sales tax until I was meeting with them and pointed that out. I said, this analysis falls flat on our face in Arizona. And they said, Arizona? I said, yeah, because they don't get property tax. And so revenue structure is different. So now they have a sales tax component to it. It also, as I mentioned, ignores the cost for parking. But this shows what we did. We just did this simplistically, just looking at Asheville's budget and just did per capita kind of stuff to show it. But you can see here that also the cost per acre is higher. Okay, it stands to reason. You know, for instance, parks, for instance, if you've got, parks the need for parks and parks operating costs are driven by people. So if you've got more people per acre, there's going to be a higher cost per acre. Same with revenue, right? It stands to reason. Also, we have found, here's my favorite part, is when they were criticized for not having cost, this was from the very first study they did in Sarasota County. They used 1989 costs from a jurisdiction on the east coast of Florida and inflated the numbers to today's and basically said that's our proxy number for cost. So the point here is it's not true fiscal analysis. It's being generated to advance a point of view that we need to increase density and encourage smart growth principles. Now, I'm not against smart growth, as you'll see here in a second. And cost realities are higher density may increase costs. This is from some work we did in California, city of Chula Vista. Higher density also may increase the cost for fire. Now, our work nationally has shown that in many cases, smart growth design principles, urban form type development